For those of you that don't know me, but I think everybody here does, my name is Melanie as well, Melanie O'Brien, the director of SFU Galleries. And it's really been a pleasure having you, Melanie, here and discussing our institutions over the last 3 days. I think in part, Amy's going to talk a bit more about this, but Bétonsalon and SFU Galleries have some connections being multi-sited institutions within universities. And I think that she's going to talk about this. There are, rich context for different ways of working and alternate forms of knowledge and learning. So it's been a very fruitful conversation with you, so thank you. Before we begin, I just wanted to acknowledge that we are here on unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations, and also that Melanie is here due to the generous support of the Consulate General of France in Vancouver, to who we extend our thanks. So Amy will further introduce, Amy Kazimierczuk, our curator, will further introduce Melanie, and I also just wanted to remind you that we will be hosting a talk by the curator, writer, and activist Lucy Lepard tomorrow night in the cinema at 7 o'clock. So Amy.
Okay, well, I'll just do a slightly more elaborate version of an introduction. But it is true that both Melanie and I had some inklings of maybe what some of the similarities and parallels were between our projects before we invited Melanie here, and now it feels very clear what the crossovers are and the mutual interests. So in 2007, Melanie co-founded Bétonsalon, a center for art and research in Paris that is integrated into the campus of University Paris 7 in the ZAC Paris Rive Gauche, a neighborhood that is undergoing dramatic restructuring. And maybe I'll just say it's something we learned recently is that, in fact, Bétonsalon is the only art center in a university in all of France. So this is not something that is very common, but was something that was done under the impetus of herself with the inauguration of this university when it was built in this community that was changing. And I think there are some maybe obvious dynamic similarities between the introduction of this building and that space in a neighborhood that's being restructured. It was founded with an interest in diversifying the visual art ecology in Paris by introducing new frameworks for artist-run research, production, and discourse. Its program of exhibitions, performances, seminars, and discussions considers the intersection of art and university research with the ambition to question normalized forms of production, classification, and distribution of knowledge. And she'll probably go into all of this. But another thing I thought was really interesting was that, in fact, there aren't visual art programs in universities in France either. And so there's something to be said for the way that artists are coming into this institution and working with artists, working with academics and specialists and researchers from other disciplines outside of art as sort of a foundation of the center. And of course, that's something we're thinking about as well between the three spaces that we run, particularly SFU Gallery on the mountain, as we start to imagine it more as an expanded research space for thinking about different relationships between visual art and other disciplines. She continues to direct the center today. In 2012, Melanie was the associate curator with artistic director Okwi and Wenzer of the Paris Triennial, which was organized by the Ministry of Culture and Communication, the Centre National d'Art Plastique, and Palais de Tokyo. In 2014, she curated Something More Than a Succession of Notes at the Justina M. Barnicki Gallery in Toronto, which was the result of a similar type of supported collaboration between two university art institutions. In 2016, Melanie, through Bétonsalon, inaugurated Villa Vassilieff. It's the second site of research exhibitions and programs. It's located in the heart of Montparnasse on the site of Russian painter Marie Vassilieff's former studio. Under the direction of Bétonsalon, the site has been reimagined as a residence and studio for international artists and researchers to address the historical and contemporary conditions of Montparnasse. So tonight she's going to be introducing this new space as a historical and contemporary site of artistic and intellectual production. And I will let her take it on from there, but we're very happy to have you, and thank you all for coming.
So how does it work, this? Yeah, perfect. Well, thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot to the French consulate and to you, Melanie and Amy. I have spent really some great 3 days meeting lots of people and artists and seeing exhibitions, having great conversations. For me, it's really precious to meet some colleagues who also run an art center inside a university, since, as you said, in France, there are no other case of an exhibition space which is labeled art center inside a university. So I thought I would give you just a little bit of background to start. I established Bétonsalon with a group of artists in 2003, in fact, so 13 years ago. And it was a time when actually most art centers in France were having their 20th anniversary, because most of them were created in the 80s under Jacques Lang, public policy to create many art centers inside France, outside Paris as well. And it was a time when actually questions were arising in, okay, did it work? How are these art centers working? Are they still connected to society? Because most of them were actually created by non-profit organizations, which were created by individuals and not by politicians. And actually, how do you keep this relation when you become an institution with what's around you, the people, the city, this is an issue that we were actually trying to question, and we thought, okay, we are a bit disappointed by the way big museums and institutions are connecting with the artistic scene. So we're going to try to create our own institution, and this is actually very important. From the very beginning, we wanted to create an institution, which for us is a place that is stable, which receives public funding, because we really believed that it is the role of public state to really support the arts, and that actually initiatives coming from individuals and artists should be more supported. So we decided we would do an art center that would be opening maybe his program to social sciences, to many practitioners from different disciplines, because we were, of course, I was with a group of artists who were very much interested in very problematic issues, let's say, of our society, dealing with the colonial history or immigration, identity debates, and they were all working in close collaboration with many researchers from social science, and we had this feeling that there was too few art centers where actually these collaborations could be really supported on an equal level. And so when we actually we started our space in a very tiny space inside Paris, in the center, with no money, nothing, from scratch. And in 2007, we got offered by the city of Paris our current space, which is this one. So this is our main space, Bétonsalon, and as you can see, we have the ground floor, and this is one building of the Paris 7 University, which is in a district. Here on the right, you can see this black square. So this is really on the border of Paris, between Paris and Ivry-sur-Seine, one of the suburbs around Paris. And this position, actually, for us to be really at the border, was very interesting in relation to what we wanted to do. And so we started to actually conceive this space as a kind of in between, let's say, artistic practice and the university that we thought could be conceived and seen as a micro-society somehow. So every day we were like facing students that actually maybe were not so interested in the arts, or actually, well, most of the students there, it's a pluridisciplinary university. So there is no visual arts section, because in France, most visual arts students actually go to an art school. But there is literature, cinema, and of course a lot of hard sciences, social sciences. So for us, this was really a great opportunity to connect maybe even more closer, because we were like in the building where all these resources were, with like some researchers that we were interested in. And so we have a program of exhibitions, and we also run a series of workshops and classes inside the university. So this is one example of a workshop that we are developing on a 3-year long period, where we invite an artist every semester to actually teach and create like a workshop situation with students in epigenetics. So these are just a few images of, the kind of, this is happening inside the exhibition space. And this is the second space that we just opened in February, which is totally different, as you can see. It's an old house built in 1900 from recycled materials from the Universal Exhibition of 1900. So like really like bits of wood and metal and different sorts of things that don't really fit together perfectly. But it hasn't really changed since it was created. And for like many years, it's a long history, but it has been the studio of a Russian artist, Marie Vassilieff, who actually is known today for having hosted Picasso, Modigliani, and all these artists in Montparnasse to create artworks, like a kind of the first art center, we could say. And then it became the Museum of Montparnasse, a very old-fashioned place, museum, with a very classic conception of museography, trying to actually pay tribute to the big masters of Montparnasse. So mainly men, actually. There were some good shows, but after 30 years, the museum was a bit, let's say, down. And the city of Paris offered us the possibility to transform the place. And we decided to create a space for walking rather than exhibiting, actually. And we also have a studio where we actually set up a program thanks to the private group Pernod Ricard, who actually, I think it's important to just like mention it, but in France sponsorship is not so developed. Public funding is still here, and so very important. But of course it's changing. And there are more and more companies who are now willing to support the arts, but very often they would create their own place, their own foundation. And we actually met with Pernod Ricard, who had this project to create their own residency place. But when I introduced this beautiful old studio and villa, actually they said, okay, we're going to work on it together. So this is quite exceptional to got this help for us. So it's only been like 2 years that actually Bétonsalon, let's say, has become an institution. So it took us 10 years to find like stability and the correct resources. And today we are like about eight employees, and our provisional budget is around like 1 million. So yeah, it's a long way to get to this situation. This is a picture of actually one of the different meetings that we organize at Villa Vassilieff. And today, our idea for this place is to kind of reflect on the current situation, like let's say, the geopolitical situation that is happening in France at the moment. Europe, France, but I mean, it's not even there only, are really stuck in some like identitarian debates that are kind of sterile, and many people actually who are like maybe like third generations of immigrants don't recognize actually themselves in these debates, and also in how institutions represent them. So I mean like museums, education, schools, university programs. There is still like a narrative, an official narrative that is being presented that actually doesn't really give a real space, a real place to many citizens who actually are still considered as foreigners, like immigrants. And the recent terrorist attacks and the refugee crisis and the upcoming presidential elections are making the situation even worse. And there is this kind of atmosphere at the moment where young people don't have any hope, let's say, anymore. They can't even imagine a future as being part of France. And so I'm really moved by this situation. Also, I don't know, I live in Saint-Denis, so it's like a city on the top of Paris, where actually you have like really a great diversity of people living there. And it's true that I've been living in Paris for 15 years, and I have seen it like being gentrified, and there is like really like a kind of distance between, we could like say it simply, like between society, like young people, you know, the next generation, and how actually the media and institutions are talking about them. And what I'm interested in is to actually work on developing like a kind of contribute to a common narrative, like a common narrative that would not be elaborated from the top as a unifying, homogeneous, you know, vision of France, but more like collectively as actually recognizing the differences and the particularities of all these citizens that actually are living in France, and look at their trajectories, how they've been like traveling from one place to another, how it actually influenced them, or they resisted to it, or how they are kind of viewed by the other as still like a foreigner. So all this kind of back and forth, let's say, between inside, outside, I think they should be more visible and actually built inside the museum's programs, inside the education. I mean, for instance, there are only 4 teachers of contemporary Maghreb history in France. I mean, for me, this is like hard to believe, but Arabic, for instance, has only been started to be taught a few months ago. There is really a lot of work, I think, to be done. And at our level, what we can do is maybe work on how actually like museums are representing like the history of, let's say, of people trajectories, artist trajectories, like over like we could just talk about the 20th century. So I think it makes sense to do that in this space, Villa Vassilieff, since it has been like the place where in Montparnasse, at the beginning of the 20th century, there were like many international artists coming from many different countries, like meeting each other, and nobody really cared where you were coming from. And so we would like to actually use this heritage, like to really continue a little bit and kind of work on alternative historiographies that are usually presented in museums. So to do that, we partnership with different museums, like the Picasso Museum, the Centre Pompidou, And we actually got access to their storage and their public collections. And we invite artists and researchers to spend some time in these storages, because most of their collection is actually not visible in the exhibition spaces. So all the unknown artists are there, most of the women artists are in the storage. So we started to do that by actually working on one specific collection that is owned by the Centre Pompidou, which is the Marc Vaux collection. So here you can see him. He is a photographer who actually spent his life photographing artist studios from the 20s to the 70s. And he actually built a collection of 250,000 glass plates. So you can see the boxes here with some names written on them by actually his wife, so handwritten. And actually she was only writing the first letter of the first name. And so we don't even know for many of these artists if they are women or men. And the Centre Pompidou actually bought this collection when the Marc Vaux died in 1977. But Pompidou opened in 1978, and actually this collection stayed, as you can see it here, till now, like this. And it was not so accessible to researchers, because actually they didn't have the human resources to actually open the storage to some people who would ask. So many of these actually glass plates were not really explored. And so thanks to a great curator who is in charge of this collection, very frustrated, we actually could invite some researchers to come and open some boxes and kind of identify some of these artists actually. So here you can see what is the current index of information on this font. So it's just an Excel file where all the names were actually written, and the number of boxes and the size of the glass plates. So this is the only tool that we could actually use to maybe decide to research in it. And so we built a research group. Here you can see a few of the different curators and artists and researchers from different countries that we invited. And we could have this special access to get to the Pompidou storage to actually understand a little bit more this collection of photographs. And why we are interested by this font is that it tells about all these artists that passed through Paris over the 20th century, and some of them just stayed for a year, but they were photographed by Marc Vaux. And what's interesting is that you can see here Wilfredo Lam inside his studio, with actually lots of information around him, papers, things he was collecting, objects that he was looking at. And we kind of, by looking at these photographs, we want to kind of open how we actually used to consider a work of art. Very often we look at it for its aesthetical qualities, but I think not enough in its context of production, how the artist was working in his studio, how actually the work was sometimes moving from the ground floor to a plinth, because the artist was making a test to actually see how his work was working. How actually the artist maybe had some correspondences with other artists, and it actually might have influenced the way an artwork could evolve. How they were using photography as well to maybe see the different stages of a painting. And I will just show you a few examples of some glass plates that we found. And here you can see a photograph of a series of works by Esther Karp, So she's a woman Jewish artist, and we saw that actually you could see several paintings on one glass plate, and it's actually quite rare within the collection. And so we started to investigate a bit more, and actually most of these paintings have actually disappeared, and they were like they disappeared because of the war. And but by doing some research, we found that one, and I don't remember how, but we actually discovered that it was stored in a private collection in Paris. So we decided to actually contact the collector to show it besides the documents and the glass plates in our inaugural exhibition. And this is like another example of an artist that we could trace a little bit his trajectory thanks to the Fonds Marvin. His name is Kip Shinbone, another Jewish artist who actually survived the camps, but his works, many of his works, of course, disappeared. And his nephew has decided to actually dedicate his life on retracing the trajectory of his uncle. And here you can see some pictures taken by Marvin. And there are, of course, some letters of how actually some works were stored in some museums, and then they moved to some others. And we could even find some drawings where he was actually making fun of Hitler. And I mean, this fond is an incredible resource to actually trace like some works and some artists who had to really like deal with some political conditions of work, tragic ones. But it's also interesting to see how actually by looking at the back of some photographs we can understand how the works were like borrowed or loaned, or how they were like registered, and sometimes in totally absurd ways. And we also worked with some artists who, thanks to the pictures we could find, created some maps of connections, like between Indian artists, like Francis Souza. There are a lot of photographs of him inside the fond, and so we could actually bring their presence inside like another kind of history of modernism in Paris. And we even invited Judy Martin, who is the widow of Billy Clover, because together they did a fantastic book on Montparnasse in the 80s, and they were actually the first ones to actually got access to the fond. And so we also wanted to have knowledge on this historical. So here you can see her with some books that she created with Billy. This is not so interesting, but this is a painting that a visitor brought us of Marvin, because he was also a painter, like a Sunday painter. So what was funny with this exhibition that we did is that there were like many people coming like almost every day, bringing some works related to some pictures that we were showing that they had actually at their home. And some actually came and saw some pictures and realized that the pictures they had were from Marvin. And so it really tells about like the fact that there is really a lot to actually write and connect. It's more a work of connecting actually that we would like to do. And here you can see an interesting picture by Marvin, where the central is a painting, but all the other frames are actually photographs that he took to actually document the different stages of the painting. So this is interesting that he actually decided to exhibit the photographs and the painting besides. And we also showed some pictures of some works by Max Ernst that were taken on a roof by Marvin, so outside the conventional frame as well of exhibiting an artwork. And we were also interested in how actually the photograph could be able to capture like some movement. So in a way, like the project we undertook was really to see how by the use of photography we could maybe put in motion like a history of art that is a bit too linear and maybe too Euro-centered. And so we were looking at some of these objects that sometimes you find on the margins of the picture. So here you can see like Calder, a work of Calder, photographed by Maho. Here, this is like the studio of Julio Gonzalez. And we were interested by all these objects that are on the ground, that are not considered artworks, but actually they were actually materials to build artworks. And today, this actually like bits of metal are not stored at museums; they are like still in the estates. And so we contacted the estate of Julio Gonzalez to actually show some of these metal structures that are actually in the picture, so that we could also consider, you know, what is not the chef-d'œuvre, but actually also the condition of production and what's left after production. And the last artist I wanted to focus on is Pan Yun-Liang, a Chinese artist. I don't know if anyone here know her, but she is actually she's the first woman Chinese artist who got a scholarship to study in Paris in the 20s. And she's quite well known in China, and even internationally, as her life has been a bit romanticized. She is presented as an ex-prostitute who actually got some international recognition. And so there is a movie on her, like many like books, but no in-depth analysis on her work. Very few things. So some students are currently doing some thesis on her work to actually reconsider her paintings. Because as a woman Chinese artist, she was not really accepted in the Parisian French milieu because she was a foreigner, and neither in China because she was actually akin to paint many nudes. And as you can see here, she was pretty much influenced by Fauvism, Matisse, in the use of color and even the postures. And here you can see another picture. But still, she kind of kept like this calligraphic, like very Chinese line. And very often when we talk about her work, we stop here. And we started a project with a curator in China to actually look at more closely at her paintings to see how actually she was very conscious about how she was being seen as the other, you know, being influenced like the Chinese, and that actually her paintings were playing on that, like playing on the fact that she was like the exotic. And so here you can see maybe an example of how she was kind of exaggerating the Chineseness with like the very dark hair, the very marked lines and the mask and the motifs on the background, and even like some in somehow I don't have other examples here, but the idea would be to look at her correspondences and the community of people in which she was like talking in Paris, to actually really like show that she was like using a lot of irony and playing on this kind of ambivalence of being like the outsider inside, and so not, you know, she would be like more like a very conscious agent. And I think very often we don't really look enough at works to actually go a bit deeper in maybe like this ambiguity that actually many artists like were very good at maintaining, and I think that if we succeed in doing so, maybe her work could be actually presented in the official parcours of the Centre Pompidou and many others, and this is a bit what we are trying to do. So I'm gonna stop here because I would like maybe to answer some questions, and so thank you.
Can I ask a question about the relationship between the curatorial collective that's working with the funds and then the artists that you actually then potentially get to work with, if I understood you correctly, then working with artists to go into those archives and make them alive in also different ways. Is that how I understood that?
Yeah. What do you mean by the relationship?
Well, my assumption is that the curatorial collective, you're going in to figure out what's there, and then you're kind of being able to shape invitations to artists to work with that material.
Well, actually, it's like a flexible group that is kind of a variable geometry, which is composed of curators but also artists. And then, you know, some curators have some specific interest, like for instance Nikita Chai from the Times Museum. He really would like to work on Pan Yun Liang. Sumesh Sharma, who runs a space in India, Clark House Initiative, is really interested in the Indian diaspora in France and elsewhere. So maybe they would start to look at these boxes, let's say, but then by talking together, we would try to connect actually these different interests and see how we can maybe trace like some connections like between them. So it's quite intuitive, let's say. In terms of methodology, for the moment there is no real methodology. And actually this is quite important because, for instance, the last meeting I had with the Centre Pompidou team, because it started to digitalize all the fonds, and actually they are like it's gonna be finished in 6 months, and then the next step for them is they employed an agency to identify the different artists on the glass plates. And the last meeting I had with them, they actually told me, you know, we are in this process now, it's very serious, we got some funding, and so we are digitalizing and then we are indexing, and it's going to be harder maybe to get access to the phone now, and also, you know, we need to take care because all these materials need to be really like looked at properly, and we need to find a methodology, and I actually agree with this, but I think that it's also important to find a kind of a parallel way of working, where like some specific requests that are actually very kind of urgent for some curators can actually just get access to the fonds, so that something can be elaborated in discussion with the work that Pompidou is doing. And this is also very much a problem, is that things are separated as if it were like, okay, one methodology, the other one, and I think this is nice to find like cross points, and this is actually, maybe this is a way that we decided to work, that we organize like seminars. So every like 2 months there is a different group of archivists, curators from public museums, artists, curators, who actually meet to discuss where they are at their research and questions of digitalization, database, and so we kind of discuss all of this, and it actually helps to connect these big institutions with practitioners actually, and this is pretty much the problem very often, that there is a huge distance.
That's all right.
I know it's important to record all these things in history so that nobody has to go through a box to. Thanks for your talk. Just total point of simple clarification, like you're talking about one project, which is this. You talk more now about one project, which with the glass, with the photographs, but you also have people that are doing exhibitions in your gallery at the university. Okay.
Yeah.
It's just a total, and that's just a sort of, how does that, and then this program, so that's an exhibition program, then you have the program where people come and do research.
Yeah, okay.
So is this like a third, so just understand this. And then I have something about Billy Kluver.
Okay. So there are two sites of activity. One is Bétonsalon inside the university with an exhibition program of 2-3 exhibitions a year. It can be solo shows, collective shows. And then there is like a series of workshops and residencies that we organize within the university. Sometimes they connect with the exhibitions, sometimes not. It's just parallel programs. And then at Villa Vassilieff, we also do exhibitions, but we try to relate them more with this research that is being undertaken around Marvin, and also with the fellows that we have in the studio, so the Pernod Ricard fellows. And in a way, Villa Vassilieff has a kind of a series of residency programs, which are in partnership with different institutions. So you have the Pernod Ricard one, we have a Goethe one, where we work with a German curator on some other projects for a 6 months period as well. And then we also work with the Maison des Sciences de l'Homme, which is like a social science institute in Paris, to also invite like non-Western researchers to come to Paris and develop their research. And we also have some other programs with Cité des Arts. So yeah, it's a lot. But it has always been a bit our kind of strategy to have like many programs running in parallel, because sometimes they actually meet, and this is also from this crossover that I think like an artistic situation can also be developed. And I really do believe that I believe in kind of accidents. So you have like a talk one day, and the other one there is this workshop, and actually the two guests meet, and it makes him something that you haven't maybe scheduled. So it's working well. But yeah, the limitation of this is that we are only 8 working in 2 sites of activity, which is not so much. And so we need to find a way actually to be still like available for all these guests that we have, and actually who really also need us, just even to translate when they go to a meeting in some archives. And we don't ask them to produce any results. So it's really like offering them like some grants so they can have time to really like work and test things. And so this is also very important to accompany them and to not let them alone in their studio. Yeah.
And just one other question about you said, is Billy Kluver's wife or whatever still alive? And
No, he's not alive. No,
he's not alive. I know, but you said you were working with his wife.
His widow. Yes,
his widow,
yes,
yeah.
Yes. She is like I think she's a bit less than 90 years old. She's very dynamic, and
because those are such amazing. The description. I was so taken always with the descriptions in his books. They're almost madness. Like this one about the Cocteau photos.
Yes,
everything is described, and he worked with a meteorologist to people don't know, to put all these photographs in line according to the way the shadow had fallen on that day. And I mean, they're kind of madness.
This book is really great. Yeah. Yes, if he like looking at the photographs, he could relocate the different places where Cocteau took Marie Vassilieff and Picasso in photograph, and like he could trace like their journey, like in Paris, like from 8 in the morning to 10 in the evening. All the archive of all these investigations that they did is actually in her house, and she lives a bit outside of New York, and it's in a total mess. and she wanted to give it to Pompidou, but at first Pompidou said, "Oh no, this is like too many materials, too messy." And actually today they are reconsidering it, and so I think they are talking to actually maybe buy the archive.
Thank you. You started your story. My car was going to be towed, so I forgot about my car, so I had to run out. So I missed the first part. I apologize for that. But you started your talk when I came in about the current geopolitical situation and the kind of situation of xenophobia and a kind of closed relationship to thinking about our current conditions globally and with the refugee crisis, etc. And you're looking back in terms of the archives at an earlier moment in modernism, Montparnasse you mentioned, and the left bank, etc. And I just trying to make the connection that in terms of doing that kind of research and seeing how, in terms of the kind of milieu, the international milieu, is still within a kind of hegemonic notion of what was the West and what was truly modern, and bringing up the wonderful Chinese artists that I liked your description of her work in terms of her own ambivalence. Those kinds of moments, if you're trying to link the possibility of artists coming in and doing something in a more contemporary sense, are you supporting more contemporary projects, or are you just trying to make that bridge to kind of make a possible analogy of the past and your kind of utopic possibilities of talking about our intertangling for so long, you know? So
yeah, maybe it's true that I didn't really insist enough on it, but yeah, it's very central to the project, actually, not to just focus on the past, and but actually to see how we can develop like working relations even between like young artists and these actually masters. I mean, for instance, we had like in residency a few like Indian artists brought by Sumel Sharma, who was like a curator involved in our project, and they decided to work on this map that I showed and also some other artworks that they created in kind of a dialogue with the pictures that they could find in the archive. But what we also very take care not to fall into also this kind of pitfall of works dealing with archives, like showing archives or you know, making something out of an image. So we try to have things that actually don't relate maybe at all with this, and see how actually this can also create like something interesting. So yeah, I haven't brought like images of the exhibition, but for instance, there was one here. Where was it? Oh yeah. So for instance, here you can see on the left, it's not working, okay. Here. A kind of a drawing by Naresh Kumar, and he actually realized it in Paris while he was in residency. And the shelf is another work by Karthik Pandyan, who also came to Villa Vassilieff to conceive this series of shelves where we could put objects as a permanent work for the villa. So we try to work a lot with artists coming in the space and developing a work also physically on it. We just opened a show, for instance, with about 15 artists who are like most of them still at school in different art schools in France, and we invited them to produce their work on site. And so yeah, I like to have this kind of dialogue, it's also very important to see how you can do it like rigorously and not just like as a pop-up. Or so this exhibition that we started to open the villa with was very with lots of objects and works and photographs, and it was a bit going in many directions. But for us, this was like a way to show, like, okay, we opened this project, and these are like glimpses of research, things we want to work on, and it's just the beginning. So, and now we are in a process where we want to actually focus more in depth on some of these artists that I introduced, but also working more like with artists on site, and like all the fellows from Pernod Ricard. They come from different countries, and most of them is their first time in Paris, and so we really want them to work on with the resources that are there. So
Do you know if there's any Korean artists in the archives? Because a lot of Korean artists, because a lot of Korean artists went to Paris.
There are many. I mean, there are many names from Asia, for sure. Then it's hard sometimes to know if it's like to actually know which country. But I think I have pointed out like a few names, yes, that are from Korea, but I can't remember the names now.
I mean, Paris was kind of like the metonym for, a kind of modernity, and also like another kind of exoticization of the West by the East, right?
Yeah.
And then also a way to kind of embrace a kind of existentialist kind of attitude, especially during the 40s and 50s, and a lot of the progressive artists that weren't happy with the particular conditions in Korea went to Paris, and I think especially women artists, actually.
Yeah. We actually have Soonjun Kim. I don't know if you know her, but she used to work at the Asia Cultural Center in the archives department, and she knows very well actually this period, and so she's part of our committee to help us like identify also like young researchers who would be interested to come and look at this more specifically.
Thank you.
Ask you a little bit to describe a little bit more what happens with these classes or these collaborations between the center and, let's say, some of the other departments at the university at Paris 7. Like what it actually looks like, who participates, how does the relationship develop, how long does it go on for, and what do you think is really going on in that type of relationship between the conditions in the context of the Arts Center and how it contributes to or modulates the kind of disciplines and processes of other departments?
Yeah. Well, when we arrived, the university was really not happy because we were some foreigners and we were taking some space inside the university, and they were lacking some room for their own exhibitions and projects, and so we had to face like a real boycott like for a few years. And so we decided we would actually work with individuals. So we went into the amphitheaters, into the classes to say hello to every person that we thought, could be open to working with us. And we actually found some great teachers who were happy to experiment something. So we started like doing very small projects. Sometimes it was just a class, like a class coming for a workshop of 2 hours, and then it became like for a semester. We worked with like cinema department. We worked a lot with the physicians. Somehow what I found is that the hard sciences were a bit more open to work with art, because they didn't have preconceived ideas of who we were, somehow, because in a way for the literature, I heard sometimes someone telling me, okay, but contemporary art might be actually a danger for our discipline, because maybe our discipline, literary, the text, could disappear if contemporary art becomes more present on the campus. These kind of things I could hear. But then, after working on some projects with the students were kind of happy to have like a different atmosphere to do their class. And for the teachers and researchers, what I heard very often was like that they could have in this space, which was not the academic space, maybe more flexibility and marge de manœuvre to experiment things, because they didn't have to maybe follow the strict lines of their discipline. They could maybe, dare to talk differently, and so this was quite interesting to see that this space that we had could be like a kind of a neutral space where everybody could just try things, and then we don't receive any support from the university, so all the projects we've done are kind of outside the curriculum, and so with teachers who would be ready to spend some time doing something more, with us. And it's only a year ago that actually we could set up a program inscribed inside the curriculum. We met like the head of the epigenetics department, and what he was interested in is to see how, by having like his students working with artists and artists working with his students, we could displace like some zones of comfort. That's how he was actually talking about it, like maybe like question like methodologies and ways to do, because very often in science you have like the poster way to show your research, the PowerPoint presentation, the text, of course, and so he was looking for like more other forms, and I think what's interesting with epigenetics is that this is in itself a discipline that is questioning itself. And actually putting in question like how the environment actually influences us, and how actually a form develops out of a process. And so we kind of found a ground where to really like build like a better relation, like a stronger one, long term, over time, and it's just the beginning, but I can see that it could actually influence some programs that are the way they are being taught at the university, and I remember also like at some point there were some Swiss students who came to us because they were doing their thesis on some post-colonial theory, and actually they were telling us that they could not create their own class on these issues because actually there was no place for it, and so they set up their seminar at our place. So then we would have like students coming for this, and so there are many different ways to actually connect, and some are not working and others are, and I think there is like but it's important to maintain like a permanent for me a relation, because it would not make sense to do our work inside this university if actually we would not have any relation and a working relation with the teachers and the students around. For me, this would be a failure. But then you have to create the conditions to make some interesting projects, and this is what is really, really hard. You need time, and very often one dynamic teacher arrives, and the year after he decides to go somewhere else, and so you have to rebuild something with another one, and the students are changing every year. So yeah, it's really like, but it's very difficult, but maybe also the fact that there is no history and previous experience of art centers inside universities in France make it maybe a more easier, I don't know, because then everybody wants to kind of try. So yeah, we've been doing a lot of things, and I'm really happy that after like almost 10 years, we can really have like one program like for 3 years with like a group of 50 students like every week inside Bétonsalon, and with different workshops, and I would like to actually work more on it to make it more central in our program.
I have just one pragmatic question, and where did the name Bétonsalon come from? Because I didn't ask, and we've been talking about these concrete edifices, and it's interesting to me.
Well, actually, one of the artists of the group decided to call it Bétonsalon. Why? It was like a kind of a joke because our space was a very tiny space, not at all in concrete, inside Le Marais, which is a very chic district of Paris. And there was this idea of a place where you can talk about serious things like concrete, but in a convivial way. So that's why the salon. And when we got offered this space, which is totally made of concrete, we thought it was like the perfect. So yeah.
Thank you. I think unless there's other questions, we'll have a drink. That's great. Thank you, Melanie.
Thanks.